Welcome to the breakout session, Mitigation Strategies in Agriculture. I'd like to introduce our speaker. Jenifer Wightman is a research specialist in the section of Soil and Crop Sciences at Cornell University. For 20 years, she has analyzed greenhouse gas emissions and sinks from agriculture, forestry, waste, and renewable energy systems. Currently, she is working on a New York State-funded greenhouse gas inventory and on future mitigation scenarios for agriculture. This is intended to establish a baseline of emissions, to identify real, permanent, and verifiable mitigation opportunities, and to help chart a path for agriculture to participate in New York State mandated greenhouse gas reduction. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jenifer.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I couldn't be more honored as someone who has been a lifelong biologist. Carbon is the currency of life, and I love carbon. Carbon should not be seen as an evil. It just is something that we need to think about, and our role in the exchange in the carbon economy. So today I'm going to talk about the greenhouse gas mitigation strategies in agriculture. And the outline of the talk, in brief, will be: what are the sources of greenhouse gases from agriculture? What is the global warming potential and why is it important? I will briefly talk about a New York case study, and I will show you how we evaluated different greenhouse gas reduction practices in New York State. And some key terms I want you to walk away from today are the ideas of real, permanent, and verifiable greenhouse gas mitigation. These are really simple English words, but they're actually very complicated to achieve, so that we are achieving net greenhouse gas accounting for the future. And part of the way I'm going to illustrate that is with our smart decision matrix to help people, farmers, and policymakers think about what are the opportunities and where to go. So what are the sources of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions? In the United States, this is from the US EPA report in 2021, which reflects 2019 data. You can see here in the pie chart that the majority of emissions come from the energy sector, right? That's the whole point of a carbon tax, is thinking about how to reduce the emissions from the energy sector. But you will also see that about 10% of emissions come from agriculture, this red part of the pie. This red part of the pie is pulled out into this bar chart in the types of greenhouse gases, or in the forms of greenhouse gases from agriculture. And you'll see that the largest source of emissions are from agricultural soil management. Enteric fermentation refers to cow burps. Quite literally, because cows collaborate with microbes, they can break down cellulose that you and I cannot eat. And in so doing, they produce beautiful food products. But as a result, the bacteria release a lot of methane. Manure management is similar. The gut is recreated in a manure storage, and a lot of methane and some nitrous oxide is removed or released. There are other categories, but what I would like to point out here is that this large bar is all nitrous oxide. These next two large bars are all from methane, and the smaller categories are from carbon dioxide. So key point number one that I want you to leave with is that methane and nitrous oxide are the two most important emission sources on farms. So anybody who wants to, you can go use the state inventory tool. It is a federally produced tool in order to do an inventory of your state. I did it using the default values. I did an inventory quickly for the Northeast region. And what you will see here is that Delaware, 88% of its agricultural emissions come from nitrous oxide, whereas Vermont, 65% of its emissions come from methane. And my point in all of this is to simply say, if you are working on your priorities for your state, if you are a low livestock state, chances are you need to focus on nitrous oxide and how you use nitrogen on your farms in your state. If you have a high livestock state, You probably should really focus on livestock, enteric, and manure management emissions of methane. You also need to think about nitrous oxide, but this really, the methane is really important. Notably, in accounting categories, the energy used on farm is not counted in the farm sector, it's counted in the energy sector. So while this is still a part of the accounting on a farm's practice, it's a relatively small one compared to the methane and the nitrous oxide. Likewise, if you're thinking on the farm level, if you're predominantly a crop farmer, you need to focus on your nitrogen use to reduce your nitrous oxide emissions. If you're a livestock farmer, there are many things you can do to reduce your enteric and manure management strategies. So, my first summary of the sources of emissions. Most of climate change is caused by very large amounts of fossil fuel combustion, adding very large amounts of CO2 to the atmosphere. Therefore, most sectors of society need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from fuel use. Agriculture, however, needs to focus on reducing its methane and nitrous oxide emissions. And it's not that agriculture produces such quantitatively large amounts of methane and nitrous oxide. It's that these two gases, methane and nitrous oxide, happen to be very potent greenhouse gases. So I'm going to talk about this potency. So different greenhouse gases have different abilities to cause climate change. And I'm introducing something called the GWP, or the global warming potential. There are two dominant factors that affect how potent a greenhouse gas is: how long it lives in the atmosphere, its lifespan, and how effective it is in trapping heat. To account for these differences, scientists have created a factor called the global warming potential, or GWP. The GWP is a measure of the total energy that a gas absorbs over a given period of time, usually 100 years, relative to the emissions of 1 ton of carbon dioxide. After applying this factor to differently potent greenhouse gases, the common unit is called the carbon dioxide equivalent, or written CO2e, or CO2eq. So on the left-hand side, you'll see these common greenhouse gases in agriculture. And on the right-hand side, you will see the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2007 fourth assessment report values for a 100-year timescale. And you'll see that methane is considered to be 25 times as potent of a greenhouse gas than CO2, and nitrous oxide is nearly 300 times as potent. Just so you know, the last slide, this is the most common global warming potential used historically. But as you can see, it was done in 2007. New York State has passed legislation that we're going to use a 20-year timescale from the 5th assessment report. And in this case, methane is considered 84 times as potent as carbon dioxide. Nonetheless, you can see that the potency, small amounts of these greenhouse gases, can largely outweigh large changes in carbon dioxide. So key point number 2, methane and nitrous oxide are potent greenhouse gases. Small changes in these emission sources multiply quickly, resulting in a large impact on the emissions inventory. So the goal of our research, and what I mean is my colleague Peter Woodbury and I, is to determine effective practices for agriculture to mitigate greenhouse gases. And I'm going to start introducing these terms: real, permanent, and verifiable greenhouse gas reduction. But before I do, I want to talk about 5 broad categories that farms can engage to mitigate greenhouse gases. First is the basic category of sequestering carbon. You can sequester carbon in trees, in soils, and in long-lived wood products. So I'm sitting in a wood chair right now, and that wood chair was probably 100 or 150 years old in a forest, and now it is in a 100-year-old chair. So it is a long-lived wood product. It is sequestered in that chair. We can destroy methane. So methane is natural gas, and you can combust it. And when you combust it, you oxidize it, and it loses its greenhouse gas potency. You can increase efficiency. That means on-farm energy efficiency, Or you can increase the amount of milk that you produce relative to the amount of feed that you need. So you can reduce how many acres you need to produce that same amount of milk. Same thing with crop production efficiency or nitrogen use efficiency. Anything you can reduce your use, you reduce all of the emissions associated. You can displace fossil fuels by producing renewable energy on your land, or by creating long-lived wood products to also displace concrete and steel, which are very energy intensive and greenhouse gas emitting building materials. And of course, my favorite is to conserve energy, natural resources, reduce our food waste, and leave forests as forests. Now, those were concepts. Now I'm targeting pulling down into areas of practice. So on a dairy farm, you can work on feed management, making your feed produce more meat and milk with less methane and nitrous oxide emissions. You can cover and flare your manure storages and eliminate this large methane emission potential. On cropping systems, you can improve your nitrogen use management, meaning synthetic nitrogen is very energy intensive. So if you can put less synthetic nitrogen on your field, then you've reduced the upstream emissions from producing that synthetic nitrogen. But then if you're using less on your field, then you have less nitrous oxide. And remember, that's 300 times as potent of a greenhouse gas. If you have woodlands on your farm, you can think about how to improve forest management so that your trees are healthier and growing faster and sequestering more carbon. Or you could consider things like agroforestry, where you add rows of trees in between your existing crops, or consider pasturing your livestock in forested pastures. If you have idle lands, such as shrub and scrub land or lands that are not productive for agriculture, you could consider growing new trees on them to sequester carbon. You could consider building solar or wind energy systems to reduce fossil fuel use. Or you could consider growing biomass to make new food products or to displace fossil fuels. And of course, again, we can all conserve energy and resources and land use. So key point number 3. Mitigation today provides the best adaptation and resiliency for tomorrow's farmers. That is, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I'm going to focus on mitigation and how do we ensure that what we're doing is being reduced meaningfully. How do we evaluate what is a good practice? Some key terms: real, permanent, measurable, and verifiable. Real, a very simple word, but it's actually quite difficult. Real means the quantified greenhouse gas reduction must represent actual emissions reduction. That means if today we're emitting 100 tons into the atmosphere and tomorrow we're emitting 99 and we continue to emit 99, that is a real emission reduction. So how did you count your net greenhouse gases? That is, did you add the benefit of carbon sequestration plus any increased emission of nitrous oxide, methane, or other CO2 emissions? Did you gather a baseline before you implemented the practice to ensure that your change made the correct direction of difference? Did you sample sufficiently, spatially, or temporally to ensure your new practice made net gains? Did you game the system by taking stuff away from one area and putting it into another area and only counting that area? There's a lot of components to what makes a real mitigation strategy. The point is, real mitigation quantitatively reduces our total emissions meaningfully. It's a real reduction to help stop climate change. So I'm going to introduce the FAST GHG tool that my collaborator Peter Woodbury and others created to show what I mean by net greenhouse gas benefit. In this case, we're looking at an example in his tool of no-till, net greenhouse gas reduction. In this case, you can see that there's a small increase in soil organic carbon and reduced fossil fuel usage because you're not going across the field as much. There are some nitrous oxide emissions, but nonetheless, you have a net reduction because you've added all of these components together. In contrast, a non-legume cover crop increases net greenhouse gas emissions because more nitrogen fertilizer is needed. So you have to produce that fertilizer, and then there are these nitrous oxide emissions that come from it. You need to add an input, which is the cover crop, which uses energy, and you need to use fuel to install that cover crop. But you have a gain in soil organic carbon. Nonetheless, your net emission is negative or not beneficial for climate change. Permanent. Climate change is a problem of hundreds of thousands of years. Is this mitigation practice that you're thinking about permanent, or is it easily reversible? And on what time scale is it reversible? So I'm going to give you sort of a silly example. So think about a bottle of soda. Imagine that it was made in Pennsylvania, and that Pennsylvania company seals that carbon dioxide into the bubbles of the can of soda. They sell it to a New Yorker who opens the bottle of soda and releases that CO2. That is very temporary and very reversible storage. But does Pennsylvania get to count a reduction and New York State count an emission? I'm trying to make 3 points here. That when we're doing this accounting, we need to think about the boundary of accounting, the reversibility of the carbon sequestration, and the time scale of that permanence. Carbon sequestration is a wonderful concept. The idea is to remove carbon from the atmosphere through biological or physical means. You can do it photosynthetically through plants and add carbon to the soil or add carbons to the stock of forests. You can do it mechanically because you remove the timber from the forest to add carbon to housing or furniture. Or you can compress that carbon dioxide and store it in old oil wells. Or my favorite, you keep the fossil fuel carbon in the ground. This is the best carbon sequestration we have. By harvesting biomass for energy on the surface, we can keep that fossil fuel in the ground. If we use other renewables like wind, solar, and geothermal, we can keep that fossil fuel in the ground. If we become more efficient, we can keep that fossil fuel in the ground. Keeping fossil fuels stored in the ground is by far the cheapest and easiest form of carbon sequestration out there. Again, a note that carbon is the currency of life, right? We need carbon to cycle, like organisms need to break down roots in order to make their own bodies as their food source, just like we break down tomatoes and apples and pears every day, releasing carbon dioxide that's been sequestered in those wonderful fruits and vegetables. The point is, because carbon is the currency of life, it has a high turnover rate, and that is the case in soil carbon. It can stay in the soil from 1 to 30 years. Whereas forest carbon can stay in the forest stock 1 year to hundreds of years, depending on how you use it. If the forest burns, of course, it's released. If the forest it grows for a long time in the forest, or if the trees grow for a long time in the forest and you harvest it to make beautiful wood products, that can be hundreds upon hundreds of years of carbon sequestration in those beautiful materials. And then, of course, fossil fuels that remain in the ground represent millions of years of carbon sequestration. So again, everything we can do to reduce fossil fuel is the best carbon sequestration mechanism. Because carbon sequestration is only as good as its permanence, and because climate change is a long game, we need to take this concept of permanence seriously. That doesn't mean that soil carbon isn't important. Soil carbon is incredibly important for soil health and fertility and farm viability, but it provides modest greenhouse gas benefit due to the permanence and other complicating issues for net greenhouse gas accounting. For now, I suggest that we focus on ag woodland management or afforestation of former ag lands for permanent carbon sequestration, and of course, anything to reduce our fossil fuel use. Measurable. Can the mitigation that you're proposing be sufficiently detected and measured? Can you gather a baseline? How frequently do you take measurements? Is it annual? Are you measuring both the carbon and the nitrous oxide? Are you doing it decadally? How many measurements are you taking? What the location of the measurements. What are the categories of the fields, the conditions, and strata that you're going to consider? And then how much effort does it take to measure your impact? And is it worth it? Verifiable. The greenhouse gas reduction must result from practices whose performance can be readily and accurately quantified, monitored, and verified. How appropriate are the tests for valid accounting? How comprehensive are your tests? Are the tests expensive? Are they easy or hard to implement? Who does the verification? Do you hire a third-party verifier? Do they have insurance? Do you have insurance? How much does it cost? How rigorous is the verification? Are you taking direct samples or are you using a lookup table? And over what time period are you managing this verification scheme? Who is held accountable that these greenhouse gas reductions are verifiably reducing greenhouse gases so that we get to our end goal? Remember the goal. Our goal is to reduce our total greenhouse gases. We can use these terms to help ensure we're providing long-term solutions to the climate crisis. Real, permanent, and verifiable mitigation. So key point number 3, when evaluating a change in practice, a baseline must be set for all 3 greenhouse gases so that they're counted together. These practices should be real, permanent, and verifiable to ensure society is meaningfully achieving climate stabilization. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip through this. And I will just say, we have serious goals, we have limited time, and we have limited money. There are plenty of good opportunities now, so let's choose wisely. Let's spend our dollars on permanent, real, and verifiable mitigation. Let's be patient while we develop new strategies with our growing awareness as we build out new research. The top 5 strategies we found for New York State agriculture were feed management for livestock, improving the efficiency or reducing how much feed goes into the livestock and how well that livestock produces milk and other products, improved manure management to reduce the methane from manure storages, improved nitrogen use efficiency, so less nitrogen in and less nitrous oxide being emitted from a field. Remember, nitrous oxide is 300 times as potent of a greenhouse gas. Manage our existing woodlands for greater carbon sequestration and consider growing trees or solar panels on former ag land that is not in current production. And I just want to remind us, it's not just agriculture. All of us depend on agriculture. So how we reduce our pressure on agriculture and citizens matters. So if we reduce our food waste, we're reducing the number of acres that are having to emit these biological emissions. I'm going to skip this. And finally, I also want to say that I have an apartment in New York City, and we have a policy in New York City that we have to reduce our footprint from our building emissions by 85% by 2050. Fines will start in 2030 in my building. We got a B- on our energy grade. And by 2035, the fines will be $50,000 a year. But the point here is everything we do to reduce our energy use in our New York City buildings reduces the pressure on upstate farms because we don't need so many acres to have solar panels. So I hope we all recognize that fundamentally what is happening here is we're moving away from a stored trust fund of fossil fuel, right, which is just ancient photosynthesis, to being bounded by the surface area of the earth to use biological systems to produce all of our feed, fuel, fiber, and food needs. And really what we are headed for are land use decision-making that's really going to change the landscape of New York and the world. I'm just going to say, finally, I think we can make our 2030 goals in New York State, but 2050 is going to require imagination to achieve an environmentally and socially equitable future. I think it's truly exciting, and we need to think and unthink the way we think. Good problems are fun to solve, so let's help each other play meaningfully. Thank you.
Okay, so we will take some of the questions that have come in. I don't know if you're familiar with En-ROADS. It's a model that people can play around with to see the effects of different types of solutions. But En-ROADS shows that the effect of reducing our meat consumption by 50% and carbon sequestration possible from improved farming practices is not large. What are your comments about this?
Okay, so I think that's totally a valid point. So I'm going to go back to the very beginning. When we look, I love math, right? It helps us see. When we look at this, right, most of our emissions are coming from energy consumption. Only 10% of our emissions are coming from agriculture. So if we reduce 50% of our meat consumption, basically we're reducing, this is not fair to say, but about half of these two charts. What I'm getting at is reductions in this area are relatively small. So I think that's an accurate statement to say that a 50% reduction in our meat and improved carbon sequestration is not going to do much. It's because our energy consumption in this country is just so huge that it doesn't make much of a percentage point. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Okay. What about, well, to go on from there, what about capturing methane for electricity generation?
Okay, so you definitely can do that. So right here, you have your manure management, and you could generate electricity from the methane that comes off of this. But again, this is a relatively small amount of methane, and the infrastructure required to put in anaerobic digesters is super, super, super expensive, and it requires lots of operation and management, and the equipment wears out. And what we're proposing, and I didn't have time to talk about, was just something simpler, which is just a cover and flare, where you're just flaring that methane. Now, you're not getting any renewable energy out of it, but what you are doing is you're ensuring that you're getting rid of that methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. Again, it's a tiny amount of energy that you can produce. Even if we did all of it, it's something ridiculous like 1 or 3% of our total energy. But then you have to worry about, yeah, I'm going to just stop there. Yes, okay. You can turn it into electricity, but it's very small.
Okay. Do you have an opinion about the creation and use of biochar for sequestering carbon and improving soils for agriculture?
Can you tell me the first words of that? An opinion? I can do an opinion. What was the other one though?
Just need to say we only have 1 more minute, so we'll have to wrap this up.
Okay. Do you have an opinion about the creation and use of biochar for sequestering carbon?
I have an opinion, and my opinion is biochar is incomplete combustion of biomass. And I would prefer that if we're going to combust biomass, that we combust it fully and maximize its fossil fuel displacement, as opposed to turning it into biochar. Displacing the fossil fuel results in millions of years of carbon staying sequestered in the soil versus biochar, which has about 100-year lifespan in the soil. So biochar is maybe part of the solution, but I would prefer that we would do complete combustion and have no biochar so that we could maximize our fossil fuel displacement.
Well, thank you all. This was a great session, and I thank you for coming.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.